So sorry, I recorded that super long video and forgot to go over the questions. So this is a little supplemental going over this week's questions in perusal. So sorry, and I'm going to work on trying to make the announcements shorter. Got a little carried away. Okay, so this is the question that I was talking about though in the last video about the one of the reasons why it's important. So of course, educational research can never help you prove anything. Instead, it gives you evidence for. It also is not guaranteed, unfortunately, to lead to better practice, but it can help you reflect critically on those claims. And that was coming up in a lot of your responses as well. Research that is focused on reducing some form of inequality in society is orientational research, like critical theory, critical race theory, feminist research, indigenous research. All of that research is focused on reducing inequality and identifying and examining for the means of emancipation power structures in our society. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that is focused on knowledge, the theory of knowledge. I was thinking about how to respond to some of your questions in perusal related to epistemology. How do I explain what is true? So epistemology is a theory. So what you read in the text is what philosophers have agreed upon. So you might want to yourself contribute to that literature, but that is their theory of knowledge and its justification, and it is a whole body of scholarship that is written about epistemology. And the reason why we talk about that in research is because the goal of research is to use our observations to draw conclusions. And so when we are doing that, we are hoping to generate new knowledge. And so we need to think about what knowledge is, where it comes from, and how we define it before we can plan a study that claims to contribute to knowledge. So that's why epistemology is important. We're not going to go into super depth in this course, but for those of you who are getting your PhD soon, you will go into it then and think about how your epistemology will inform your methodology that you are choosing and all the decisions that you make as a researcher. Now, when we're thinking about mixed methods uses elements of both quantitative and qualitative. So in a mixed method study, you are going to have some type of hypothesis testing where you are using statistics to examine and understand the relationship between one variable and the next. So that will rely on statistics, which is a form of numerical analysis. And then you are going to have elements of qualitative, which is using interviews, observations, analysis of text to understand a phenomenon. So in-depth interview is associated with qualitative, a structured questionnaire. Since the questionnaire is structured, I'm thinking that it's going to be one of those questionnaires that is like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree? So you are collecting numerical data that you can connect to another variable, such as years experience teaching, income level, gender, something like that. Researchers giving a group of participants a quantitative questionnaire. So again, it's going to be that 1 through 5 rubric, then conducting a quantitative survey of a larger group. So this is definitely not mixed because even though there's multiple data sources, they're both quantitative. Conducting an in-depth case study of homeless people who live in a park. So a lot of times mixed methods or case studies do use mixed methods, but since this is in-depth case study, it doesn't really tell me necessarily. Causal comparative research method. So this is going to be using quantitative measures. So since this is using both in-depth interviews and then a structured questionnaire, the structured part tells you that it's not open-ended. Open-ended would be qualitative. This one is the example of mixed methods research. The homelessness study might be, but they didn't really give you enough information to say. Number 5, which the following is an example of a non-experimental research. So non-experimental research is quantitative. So it is going to be quantitative. There are going to be variables, and you are looking at the relationship between them. But the difference between experimental and non-experimental is whether or not you are manipulating the independent variable. So that manipulation word is super important for a variety of reasons, but in this case, for finding out which one is experimental. So manipulates how students are taught statistics. So maybe you teach statistics to 2 different periods. One period you use a flipped method where they watch the lecture at home and then in class they practice. And then the other one you give the lecture in class and they do the practice at home, and you try to see which one. So you're able to manipulate how they are taught it. You can't use random assignment, but manipulates how they're taught to solve word problems. Maybe one group they use a particular graphic organizer, and the other group they use a manipulative, and you see which one is more effective. This one looking at the correlation between speed reading and reading comprehension, or between reading speed and reading comprehension. So there you are looking at the relationship between a variable, but you're not manipulating it. And the reason why is, I guess you could tell a student like read slower, read faster, but if you were doing this research question, you would probably want to correlate it based on how the speed that students naturally read, as opposed to telling them to either read slowly or fast. A researcher assigned students with ADHD to one of 2 drug treatment groups and impacts the drug conditions on ADHD symptoms. So, so they're getting either one or the other drug, and that's what is being manipulated. So the only one where they're not manipulating the variable, meaning like the intervention, is C. So studies that non-experimental research, that's why it said in the text and in the slides that non-experimental research is much weaker at determining cause and effect. Reading speed doesn't cause you to have better or worse reading comprehension to beyond a certain point. But you can look at the correlation between that too. And really a lot of this data a lot of this research that has found a correlation between the two have given teachers like myself who teach 3rd grade some guidelines. Hey, most students who read about this many words per minute are able to comprehend. So try to help them decode until they can read up to this point. So experimental research. So these 3, A, B, and D, are examples of experimental research because there is manipulation. The other component is they need to have random assignment to the groups to try to decrease any type of bias between who is getting what treatment. A researcher studies the profiles of national merit scholars to determine what factors are associated with their success. So A sounds like a great study to me, but A is a qualitative study. So that was one of the questions that came through, and oftentimes there is, in our society, we're much more familiar with quantitative research. We say things like numbers don't lie, and that can be misleading in a lot of different ways. And we have less familiarity with qualitative research. When we are going through school, we learn the scientific method, and we don't typically learn about qualitative approaches to generating knowledge. But A is a great example. So hopefully you can see that there's a lot of benefits of doing this study because it can help us identify things that might help other students be more successful by studying a group of students who are really successful. But in order to do this, you might use some quantitative data, like you might use some things like number of extracurriculars that they studied, but you would probably use some things like interviews, maybe observing them at school, interviews with their parents. Maybe you would do a text analysis of the courses that they took, look at their transcript to try to see that, like study some different characteristics of their schools, their neighborhoods, to understand what was happening in their lives that led them to have this success. So that would be an example of qualitative. So definitely not experimental. There's no manipulation of the variable. Does a study where he manipulates the type of memory strategy students are taught and measures their recall. So here you can see they are either getting this particular strategy or not. So that's how they are manipulating it. Examines the correlation between anxiety and time to study a mathematics problem set. So C might be a great study. And so it does say in the text that if you're able to do an experimental design, it's better to do that than non-experimental. That's true, but there are a lot of instances, especially in education or any research that is dealing with people, where it's just not ethical to do so or impossible. So mathematics anxiety, that's not like a static, but you can't manipulate that variable, like whether or not, or the degree to which someone has anxiety around math is in many cases a fixed or predetermined attribute that participants will bring to the study at that moment in time. They might be they might outgrow it in a way or have some coping strategies that change, but at the time that they're participating in that study, that's a, for the most part, fixed construct that you can't assign. You can't say, okay, for this study, you're going to have math anxiety and you're not. That's an example of a variable that is not possible to manipulate. So therefore, that could not be an example of experimental research. And you also see that as correlation. But again, there could be a lot of benefits and a lot of important implications from this study that could positively impact math teachers' classrooms based on the outcomes of that study. A researcher does a study where she carries out a survey. So surveys oftentimes are quantitative, and this one is that quantifies student beliefs about math and then follows up with a series of qualitative interviews. So this is an example of mixed methods because it has the quantitative survey and then the qualitative interviews. So this one is the experimental. And then number 7. So number 7 is, okay, let me just talk through it a little bit. So I'm going to study how students adjust to a new country and study abroad. The conclusions are going to emerge from her work. So this wording is telling me that this design is inductive. The conclusions are going to come from the observations as opposed to making a hypothesis and then collecting data to confirm, like a deductive approach. So it's inductive, maybe exploratory, explore how students are adjusting. She starts with interviews with students. Okay, so now we already knew it was going to be emerging, inductive, now interviews. It's definitely qualitative. So since it's qualitative, it's not C or D because qualitative is inductive, quantitative is deductive, and experimental research is a type of quantitative research. So it's either going to be grounded theory or narrative inquiry. So she is generating it based on interviews. Now, we haven't learned this yet, but we will. Both grounded theory and narrative inquiry rely on interviews as a primary data source. So interviews get some ideas from the interview, like develops like some findings, some themes, then goes back and interviews staff from the program to further confirm her theory. So the type of qualitative research that intends to generate theory is called grounded theory. After interviewing the staff, she goes back again to interview to confirm the theoretical model that she developed. This process of theory building inductively, letting the data drive the theory, is called grounded theory. Now, narrative inquiry is when you interview people, and there's several different approaches to narrative inquiry, but it is based on the idea that we can understand human experience through having them tell stories, retell stories, or use a narrative structure to communicate an experience, and use a narrative analysis approach to understand the research phenomenon. Okay, so that is a little discussion of those questions. Sorry, I didn't include this in the response. That was my whole purpose of making that video. But thank you for those of you who watched this little extra piece. And email me if you want me to clarify any of these further, or write me a little note in Perusall, and I will respond there so everyone can see. Bye again.